Chapter 12 of Fact Stranger Than Fiction by John Patterson Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Great Britain. My senatorial term being ended, I declined to stand as a candidate for another election on the ground that it entailed too great a financial loss on me, and also that my professional business was slowly but surely diminishing, for I had already found out that when a business man has a legal affair to be looked after, he is apt to select a lawyer and not a politician to attend to it. And besides the loss of time from my practice and the outlay of cash incidental to political campaigns, my keep at Columbus, and incidentals such as the demands of charity and being a good fellow, amounted to more than I could continue to sacrifice. The following table will prove my contention in this behalf. 5 legislative campaigns at $300 each, $1,500. 24 months at Columbus lost to my business at $200 per month, $4,800. 24 months board at Columbus at $25 per month, $600. Charity and good fellowship money, $100 per year, $100. Lost to business indirect by neglect, $1,200. Total, $8,700. Receipts from salary, 6 years at $600 per year, $3,600. Total loss, $5,100. The foregoing is an under rather than over estimate of my loss during the 24 months I served in the General Assembly, for the sessions were held in the winter and early spring, when all the courts were in session, and my professional loss was almost total. Moreover, during that time I lost many good, valuable clients whose patronage I never recovered, and over and above all, some of my clients became offended by reason of the active part I took in opposition to their party and friends, and dropped me. But enough of this. Statistics are dry, complaints are unpleasant. My grip was duly packed for my European tour. The au revoir were all said, the steam was up and the sails inflated, and I was on my way not for Mandalay, but for sights and scenes which from my childhood had been for me pleasant dreams, now to be realized. Does the reader wish to know whence I derived the means of defraying the expenses incidental to this protracted trip, after the collapse of my arrangement with Colonel Shepard, due to his death? Well, I will let him into the secret. When I was fighting for the bill to finance the improvement of our system of parks and boulevards, the argument most persistently pressed against the passage of it was, that parks and boulevards were for the rich, not for the poor; that it would be the unjust appropriation of the people's money to foster the pride and pleasure of the rich. To which I answered in substance, that the rich, like Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Gordon, Mr. Wade, and others, had parks of their own, and many wealthy people spent their summers at seaside and mountain resorts, and their winters at Palm Beach and in California, and therefore could get along without these so-called luxuries at home if necessary, while the poor were constrained to remain at home the year round, and of all the inhabitants of Cleveland most needed the few luxuries. Well, the law having been enacted and the system now assured, some of our leading citizens said, "Now, Mr. Green, your fight secured the passage of our park bill, and since your contract with Colonel Shepard must be abandoned, we will pay a part of your expenses if you will visit the parks in different parts of Europe, and write a series of letters to the newspapers here regarding the classes of people who most use and seem to derive the greatest pleasure from frequenting them." I readily agreed to this suggestion. Thereupon they contributed each a generous amount, which, with the check sent to me by Mrs. Rockefeller through her great husband, easily made me comfortable during the whole trip. The stanch and swift Cunard ship Umbria made the run to Liverpool in 7 days, and after landing I went as the crow flies to the Adelphi Hotel, the leading hotel in Liverpool at that time. I registered and was installed in a cozy room, where temporarily I was at home. In the dining room I was treated far differently than at the Gibson House in Cincinnati, as the guest of the Amalgamated Trades. Not only was my silk hat taken at the door, but the waiter in his dress suit served me in a genteel way, and when I went into the barber's shop I was shaven without objection. In short, I immediately forgot that I was a colored American citizen, and when the United States consul called on me, presto, I had changed to a full-fledged citizen, abroad, still under the aegis of my dear native land. I have made 4 visits to Europe, and on each occasion saw and experienced many things which I am sure will be of interest to the reader. I shall not attempt a detailed narrative of them, but will review the principal features in a general way, beginning with Great Britain, and following the trend of my travels into other lands. The late Dr. Adnet, who had been the travelling companion of the late John Huntington when he made a tour of Europe, very kindly had provided me with letters of introduction to sundry persons of distinction in London and its suburbs, amongst whom were Werner, of the Tower of London, a distinguished man, by the way, who at the close of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 had been the bearer of dispatches for the Prime Minister of Great Britain, which were closely connected with the final settlement of the peace proceedings. This letter gave us the enter into the Tower, and the opportunity of seeing much and of hearing some of the traditionary lore which otherwise we could not have enjoyed. My late friend Mr. Fred J. Loudon had also given us letters of introduction to some of his former friends and acquaintances, which opened doors for us which otherwise we probably would never have entered. In addition to Werner, we met many other persons of social place and distinction, of whom may be mentioned the Lord Bishop of London, Canon Farrar of Westminster Abbey, Reverend Dr. Joseph Parker of the City Temple, Reverend John Clifford, D.D., LL.D., L. Menzendorf, of Idle Lane, large exporter, S.J. Celestin Edwards, scholar, organizer, and lecturer on the universal brotherhood of man, Mr. and Mrs. L.G. Sharp, high in musical circles, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Coleridge Taylor, great musicians, Mrs. Eliza Leach, of No. 4 Kensington Palace Garden, and many others. Amongst the objects of especial interest to us may be mentioned Westminster Abbey, the British Museum, St. Paul's Cathedral, the Tower of London, London Bridge, Crystal Palace, the Houses of Parliament, the Horse Guards, Westminster Hall, and numerous parks, great amongst which Hyde Park and Kensington Park were conspicuous. Then there were Trafalgar Square, the National Museum of Art, the Nelson Monument with its heroic lion's couchant, to say nothing of the Law Courts, the Bank of England, the ancient and famous sites of past and present theatres, with Piccadilly Circus, Leicester Square, with the Marble Arch, and Old Curiosity Shop, made famous by Charles Dickens. Indeed, London is such a little cosmopolitan world within itself, that the mere mention of a few of its most important personages and objects of interest would fill the pages of a little book. As an illustration of the manner in which even old residents are at times surprised by new discoveries of old institutions, I will relate the following. One day Mrs. Green and I, strolling down Oxford Street, made a detour when we were near High Holborn, just following our noses, when to our surprise we found ourselves in Lincoln's Inn Fields, of historic fame, where, if I mistake not, at one time numerous executions took place, and some other affairs of more worthy note were transacted. Quite unexpectedly we found ourselves in front of the residence of the late Sir John Soane, wherein is now kept on exhibition a museum of paintings, statuary, and Egyptian and Oriental relics, which cannot be duplicated. To mention only 2 will tend to enlighten the reader. There is an alabaster sarcophagus 9 feet 4 inches in length, 3 feet 8 inches in width, 2 feet 8 inches in depth, and 2.5 inches in thickness. The alabaster is of such purity that a lighted lamp being placed on the inside shines through the sides of the casket. Another curio is the original paintings by Hogarth of the Rake's Progress, showing the slow but sure decline of a handsome, promising youth, through dissipation, from good health to disease and death. We spent the remainder of our day in that one little museum, of which a few hours before we had no knowledge whatsoever. Another incident, quite surprising to me, was that of the discovery of an old arcade near the heart of West London by my friend Mr. L.G. Sharp, who just prior to the World War was the world agent of Paderewski, the unapproachable pianist. We were going down into the city from Wandsworth Common when we ran upon this mart of trade, all unknown to or forgotten by this world-travelled man. I have 4 men in mind now, of whom I am sure my readers will be pleased to hear something, and I will speak briefly of them. The first is the Lord Bishop of London, of whose unselfish and persistent labours for the uplifting of the poor and needy in the slums of London the whole civilized world has heard. Even in Wall Street in the city of New York, during his visit to this country some years ago, his voice was heard in support of the Golden Rule. I had never met the Lord Bishop before, and my good fortune in meeting him on this occasion was due entirely to the kindly interposition of my good and helpful friend, the Right Reverend W. A. Leonard, Bishop of Ohio, who mailed to me while I was in London a letter of which the following is a true copy. Right Honourable A. F. Winnington Ingram, Lord Bishop of London. My dear Lord Bishop, it gives me great pleasure to hand this letter of personal introduction to you of the Honourable J. P. Green, formerly Senator from this city in our legislature, and for a number of years identified with public interest. He is one of our most highly esteemed citizens and represents his race with dignity and satisfaction. He is a communicant of the Church and one of the vestry of St. Andrew's Parish in the city, which is our only congregation amongst the colored people of Cleveland. He will greatly esteem the honor of meeting your lordship, and I will be glad to have him get the inspiration from you, which we all do. With cordial good wishes for this new year upon which we have entered, I am with respect faithfully yours, William A. Leonard, 3054 Euclid Avenue, Cleveland, Ohio, USA. As soon as I had received the bishop's letter, I mailed it to London House, St. James Square, Southwest London, and in due course of the mails I received the following answer. John P. Green, Esquire, 42 Walterton Road, Paddington West. Dear Sir, the Bishop of London will be pleased to see you here at 11:30 on Saturday the 20th. Yours faithfully, K. G. Everett, Private Secretary. On time, on the appointed day, I was duly received by the great and worthy bishop, and unceremoniously ushered into his cozy workshop, as he was pleased to term his office. There was no sign of affectation in the demeanour of this great man, no patronizing air or lifting of the brows by this well-bred English lord, but grasping my hand, he bade me be seated, and the conversation began as though two old friends had cordially met. Well now, he said, tell me about your people in the United States. When I attended the council in Richmond, Virginia, I heard one phase of the subject, but I would like to hear your side of it. I thanked him and did my possible, as the French would say, to enlighten him as regarded the Negro question from the standpoint of a colored American, and was highly rewarded to discover that his views largely coincided with mine, and that he too, like many another great man, let his sympathies go out in favor of the underdog. I intimated my fear that I was taking up too much of his time, to which he replied that he had no other engagement for the forenoon until His Eminence Bishop Matthews, the Catholic Bishop of London, should call, and requested me to be quite at ease until that time. By the way, he exclaimed in the course of our conversation, what shall I do with this beautiful letter, holding in his hand the letter of introduction from Bishop Leonard? I may lose it in the confusion of my office, and since it is of such personal concern to you, would you not like to have it? I assured him that I would be most pleased to receive it, and he gave it to me. This accounts for the fact that I am able to give to my readers a true copy of it, as recorded in the foregoing. I discovered that the Lord Bishop has a vein of humour pervading his system, for he took occasion to refer to a humorous incident which owed its origin to the word Ohio during the sessions of the Ecumenical Council in Richmond, Virginia, in the first decade of the present century. It was in this wise: quite a large percentage of the clergy attending the council used the consonantal I, pronounced E, thus pronounced Ohio, Ohio, and drew a smile from our dear Bishop Leonard when they referred to him as the Bishop of Ohio. When the presence of the Catholic bishop was announced, he was seated in an adjoining room while he wrote for me and my wife 2 passes to St. Paul's Cathedral to be used on Easter Sunday, 1909, saying, "Here, Senator Green, if you will present these to one of the vergers in St. Paul's Cathedral on Easter morning, he will show you and Mrs. Green to reserved seats near the chancel, and you will see that in England we make no such discriminations as you have experienced in your South land." He also gave me a pass, which entitled me to a seat in the visitors' gallery in the House of Commons, which, as the others, was duly used. Grasping my hand and thanking me for the call, we separated, I full of pleasure and enthusiasm, he beyond doubt conscious that in having done his bit to one of the least of these, he had advanced his cause on earth. The second personage to whom I shall call attention was the late Reverend Frederick William Farrar, canon of Westminster Abbey and rector of St. Margaret's Church, which stands near, adjacent to the old abbey. I was enabled to meet Canon Farrar through the courtesy of the late ex-president Fairchild of Oberlin College, who quite painstakingly wrote me a beautiful letter of introduction on his little office typewriter, and after receiving it I was loath to surrender it to the distinguished prelate, for I am unable to state to this day whether I was prouder to meet Canon Farrar than to receive this mark of respect and esteem from so distinguished a personage as President Fairchild. There was nothing in the fact of being received by Canon Farrar, except that I was highly honored by being permitted to call on a distinguished churchman, scholar, and author in the ancient Dean's Yard, contiguous to the sacred land on which for centuries has stood Westminster Abbey. After mutual greetings and a pleasant conversation relative to the conditions in America, we separated to meet again in the near future at Westbourne Baptist Church, where he delivered a learned and eloquent lecture on John Milton. To me it was a significant fact that the canon of Westminster Abbey was in the pulpit of a Baptist church presided over by Dr. John Clifford, who was the incarnation of opposition to the established Church of England, and was waging persistent warfare against it in all parts of Great Britain. But since John Milton himself belonged to the dissenters, perhaps the transition was not remarkable. The third great man with whom I came in touch was the Reverend Dr. Joseph Parker, and I am inclined to the belief that I scraped this acquaintance by virtue of the colored American push and persistency with which, 25 years ago, I was endowed. Dr. Parker for some 30 years had been accustomed to preach a Thursday noon sermon, which, with the beautiful singing and other attractions, drew large congregations of the literary elite of the whole civilized world to hear him. For there is not a day but that multitudes of wayfarers from all the points of the compass find their way within the walls of the greatest city, looking for attractions of one kind and another. Dr. Parker received me in his sacristy after preaching one of his famous sermons, and having in my possession the letter which the Lord Bishop had returned to me, I showed it to him. He read it with evident pleasure, and invited me to call at his home on the following day, and dine with him and his good wife. It is needless to say I accepted the invitation with undisguised pleasure, and spent an hour with the distinguished couple which I shall remember to the end of my life. The conversation turned on great Americans, and also on the subject of public lectures. Dr. Parker expressed the opinion that not even the Reverend Thomas DeWitt Talmage, with all his eloquence, could draw a large audience in London at that time to hear him lecture, so coldly were lecturers then received. I asked him what he thought Henry Ward Beecher's chances would be were he alive and active. He was of the same mind in both cases. Then, changing the subject somewhat abruptly, he exclaimed, "I regard that countryman of yours, a great philosopher, Frederick Douglass, I refer to." I readily assented to that view with a degree of pride, and said that Gambetta, the great French statesman, had recently expressed the same opinion. I heard an anecdote concerning him. Douglass related recently, he added, on one occasion, as the story runs, subsequent to the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law and the rendition of the Dred Scott decision, the outlook for the cause of emancipation was dark and well nigh hopeless. There was a meeting of the Friends of Liberty and Progress. Douglass was demure and of a downcast demeanor. Old Sojourner Truth noticed these signs of discouragement, and at a proper time she exclaimed in her piping voice, "Frederick, is God dead?" That exclamation, so full of truth and hope in the power of Almighty God, coming as it did from that infirm old woman, rekindled the fire within them, and so inspired them that from that moment onward all was vigor and determination to win. The personal of Dr. Parker in the pulpit was reassuring, so to speak. One saw at a glance a real man in his size, form, and general bearing, one of nature's noble men. He carried between his shoulders a large head, a high expansive forehead, eyes deep set beneath the umbrageous brows, and a shock of shaggy hair, which caused him, when animated, to present that leonine appearance which was altogether unmistakable, and his deep sonorous voice was quite suited to the man. He was such a plebeian and approachable man, that after his ponderous and entertaining sermons were delivered. He took pleasure in answering questions and in conversing with any one who visited him in his sacristy. This writer had the good fortune on more than one occasion to meet him there, and he condescended to spend some minutes in pleasant, instructive conversation with him. On one occasion he said, "Well, you heard me preach the same sermon twice. I preached it last Thursday, and I repeated it today." I answered that it was well worth repeating, for it was replete with instruction and edification. On the occasion referred to, when Dr. Parker in my presence spoke in such admiring terms of Frederick Douglass, he expressed an ardent desire to possess a copy of the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and on my return to our flat I mailed one to him, which I happened to carry in my luggage. The second day thereafter I received a letter from him, enclosing a check for the sum of £1 sterling, an equivalent at that time of about $4.83 of our money. After thanking me for my thoughtfulness and kindness in sending him the book, the letter proceeded to read, "I enclose a £1 check for that son and heir of yours. I want him to see what a British sovereign looks like. It is scarcely necessary to add that the son and heir, now Captain William R. Green, lost no time in making the acquaintance of that identical sovereign, but in the language of King Richard III, on an inauspicious occasion, he could have truthfully said, 'I'll have it, but I'll not keep it long.'" The last, but by no means the least, of the distinguished Londoners of whom I shall now speak, is Reverend John Clifford, D.D., LL.D., pastor emeritus of the Westbourne Baptist Church, whose name is more familiarly known than that of any other in Great Britain, save that of Lloyd George, perhaps. Dr. Clifford has spoken much and written extensively in the furtherance of every good cause which has come before the British public during the last 50 years, and prior to the Great World War it was generally believed of him that his influence for good in Great Britain was greater than that of any other man, except the Prime Minister. When Dr. Parker was expressing to me his doubt as to whether Mr. Talmage or even Mr. Beecher could attract a large audience to listen to a lecture in London in 1893, he added, "If any one in London can get out an audience to listen to a lecture, Dr. John Clifford is the man to do it." And he gave me a letter of introduction to him, which was the foundation of a friendly acquaintance between us, and has resulted in the mutual exchange of some interesting and valuable instruction for me, to say the least. Dr. Clifford is the bête noire of the State Church of England. He has spoken against it, organized for warfare against it, and written volumes in opposition to it. It remains to be seen during these turbulent times following, in the wake of the World War, what will be the fate of that relationship between the State and the Church, which has subsisted for so many centuries. That the doctor is not narrow and intolerant, I feel sure, for he is constantly working for a union of all the orthodox churches, and I have shown that by his invitation. Canon Farrar of the State Church lectured from his pulpit on the subject, John Milton, to an audience composed largely of Baptists. We had not resided in London long before we became associated with a goodly number of congenial persons, whose every effort was in behalf of our comfort and pleasure, amongst whose names those of Mr. Harry A. Williams and his wife, Mrs. Lizette Williams, Mr. Clarence Cameron White and his wife, Mrs. Beta White, Mrs. Eliza Leach and her companion, Miss Martineau, a niece of the late distinguished authoress Harriet Martineau, Mr. L. G. Sharp and his wife, Mrs. Adele Sharp, Mr. S. Coleridge Taylor and his wife, Mr. L. Mensendorf and his wife and daughter of Belem, Mr. Henry J. Thrift and wife, Mrs. Mattie Lawrence Thrift of Fairfield Lodge, Croydon, and many others, all of whom we still hold in sacred remembrance, even should we never again meet them on this earth. Scotland. Through the kindly offices of Mr. S. J. Celestin Edwards, a colored man, residing at that time in London, and publishing a small periodical entitled Fraternity, an arrangement was made by which I was invited to visit Scotland as the guest of the Society for the Promotion of the Universal Brotherhood of Man. I had visited Scotland before, but only for a brief sojourn. Now, however, was the opportunity of becoming acquainted not only with its rocks and rills, its woods and templed hills, but with her lads and lassies and her home life, with which, through the reading of her literature, I already felt almost familiar. I doubt whether it comes within the realm of possibility for a person of pure African or white blood to understand the feeling of one who has a modicum of both, a man who shares equally the blood of both races, or who, as in some instances has a preponderance of the blood of the English or Scotchman leaping and bounding in his arteries, and yet is ignored to some extent by both. There is a trite old saying that blood is thicker than water, and I believe it is eternally true, for he cannot hold to the one and despise the other, as in serving God and mammon. For the Negro blood is very strong, and will manifest itself in some instances unto the third and fourth generation, while of the Scotch English blood it is equally true, it does not quail in the presence of man or beast. Is it any wonder, then, that constituted by blood as this writer is, he should feel in Scotland as did that famous warrior when he exclaimed, "Ye crags and cliffs, I'm with you once again"? Or as that other one, John Home, who makes one of his characters to say, "My name is Norval on the Grampian hills, my father feeds his flocks." I love to gaze upon the rock-ribbed lands as the rapid train whirled us through the grand old country. In my mind I had always associated Scotland and her heroes to some extent with Switzerland and her freedom-loving sons. The highlands and beautiful lakes of Scotland reminded me of the mountain declivities of the little republic, with their splashing, dashing waterfalls, rippling streams, and enchanting blue lakes. And who can read of Wallace and Bruce? Of the former, of their romantic daring, astounding acts of heroism for liberty, and not think of William Tell and Arnold von Winkelried, of the latter, who defied tyrants and even death itself in behalf of the same. Let not my readers, however, imagine for a moment that all my race pride is swallowed up in my admiration of and love for England and Scotland, for unfashionable as may be in some parts of the world at present, it is nevertheless historically and metaphysically true. The Negro is descended from an antiquity antedating even that of some of our most powerful and favored nations of the present day, and the continent of Africa can lay claim to a climate in some of its parts, and relics of past wealth and grandeur, which fill travelers with astonishment and awe. The great Bishop Heber, when he wrote "Where Afric's sunny fountains roll down their golden sands," realized a part of this at least, and who can doubt that when John Milton wrote these ravishing words following, that he too had Africa in mind? Now gentle gales, fanning their odoriferous wings, dispense native perfumes, and whisper whence they stole those balmy spoils. Paradise Lost, Book 4, page 118. The Africans were always brave in war, for we read in the records of the Crusades that under one of those brave captains, fighting for the Holy Cross, valorous deeds were done by his Negro troops, and centuries before that, in Homer's time, Virgil speaks of them as having been in the great review before the walls of Troy. In Book 1, line 489, Virgil says, "Eos acris et nigri memams arma." Those eastern ranks and the black arms of Memnon, and the learned commentator tells us that Memnon, the son of Tithonus and Aurora, and nephew of Priam, came with both Oriental and Ethiopian forces to the succor of Troy, and was slain by Achilles. And I can never forget the eloquent tribute paid by the late Senator Roscoe Conkling of New York, when, speaking in the Garfield campaign, he said, "Their fathers fought and subdued lions and tigers in the forests of Africa when our ancestors were yet in ignorance." Of the Egyptian antiquities, the oldest monuments show the Negro and Negroid features. The Sphinx, the age of which is so far back that it has not as yet been ascertained, has the features of the Negro. One of the modern commentators, in speaking of its nebulous age, says the priests of Nera supposed it to represent Horus, to hold up its head and catch the first light of his father, Ra, the rising sun. In my own native land, the United States of America, the success of the Negro is even now puzzling the biologists, for he not only increased numerically while for 250 years he was driven under the yoke of slavery, but since his manumission, without jewels of silver or jewels of gold, he has increased in numbers at an alarming rate. To some people, reduced his illiteracy to a minimum, where he has had a fair opportunity, voted for the welfare of the Republic, and heroically fought and died for democracy, save the mark. Unlike the Indian, the white man's civilization cannot kill him. On the contrary, he thrives in the midst of it. He has followed the white man everywhere, even to the top of the earth, and it looks as if in the wisdom and mercy of Almighty God, the two races are destined side by side to work out their destiny upon this American stage of action. But let us return again to Scotland, the home of brave men, bonny lassies, of poets, historians, philosophers, theologians, and humanitarians. Here was the home of Hume, Macaulay, Carlyle, Livingston, Allan Ramsay, John Knox, Bobby Burns, James Boswell, Sir Walter Scott, and many others. I was met at the station by several members of the Society in Edinburgh, and escorted to No. 5 Malta Terrace, where resided Mrs. Frances M. Saleeby, the widow of a gentleman who, when teaching in Syria, fell literally from the housetop and lost his life. Mrs. Saleeby is the mother of two noble sons, Frank, late deceased, and Caleb W. Saleeby, M.D., F.R.S., Eden, who is the author of several voluminous works on medico-philosophic and biological subjects which are read around the civilized world. In the home of Mrs. Saleeby I did not lack for any comfort. The two sons, then boys, surrendered to my use during my stay their own bedroom, and little Frank acted as my guide, to make sure that nothing worthy of notice escaped my attention in the famous city, while the mother, assisted by some of her many friends, arranged a series of entertainments for my pleasure and profit. My coming had been heralded to some extent, and a meeting to be held in the Carubers Close in the High Street, almost contiguous to the old John Knox residence, had been amply advertised. On the occasion of the meeting I had the honour of addressing a large audience of Scotch men and women for the first time on their native heath. Invitations to social functions were numerous and kept me busy. Amongst those who extended these courtesies to me were Mr. and Mrs. Sangster and family, who had recently returned to Great Britain after an absence of 35 years in government service in India. It was an intelligent and very interesting family. Another was Mr. Marshall and daughter, of 4 East Castle Street, who gave me a drawing room. That is to say, the parlours were furnished with chairs to accommodate a numerous audience, and a personage of known prominence in the community presided. When the invited guests are all seated, the chairman, in a few well-chosen words, introduces the guest of the occasion, who in an address of some 30 minutes makes known his mission and the causes sustaining it. At the conclusion of the speech he answers such questions as may be propounded to him. Then any brief comments are indulged in by individuals in the audience, which may seem apropos, and after that light refreshments are partaken of, and the drawing-room is ended. Mrs. J. Miller, of York Place, a near relative of the late John Bright, next received me. It was on the occasion of a drawing-room given in honour of Reverend Dr. Laws, who at that time had been a missionary on the west coast of Lake Nyanza for 19 years. I spoke by invitation for 10 minutes on the subject, the Coloured American. Mrs. Miller is, or was, I know not whether she be still living, the daughter of the late Duncan Maclaren, who represented Edinburgh for 15 years in the House of Parliament. His widow was a sister of the late John Bright, one of Mrs. Miller's brothers, as was a Lord Justice of Scotland, and another Walter Stowbright. Maclaren was in Parliament. Mrs. Elizabeth Pease Nicol, of Huntley Lodge, Napier Road, Matcheston, Eden, signally honoured me by inviting me to call on her. Mrs. Pease was at that time 86 years of age. She was a beautiful elderly lady with a fair complexion and silvery white hair, and was totally blind, but with mental faculties quite unclouded. Her late husband, Professor John Pringle Nicol, was associated with the University of Glasgow for many years, and was famous as an astronomer, some of the treatises written on that science being 3 books entitled Views of the Architecture of the Heavens, the Stellar Universe, and the Planetary System. Mrs. Nicol, in her active life, had been the intimate acquaintance and friend of the late William Lloyd Garrison, who was her guest for 2 weeks on the occasion of his visit to Scotland. She had 2 portraits of Mr. Garrison hanging on her walls, and also a marble bust of him, and even then, being stone blind and almost 90 years of age, she was in regular correspondence with his sons, and kept fully advised as to public affairs. Mrs. Nicol was proud of the fact that both she and her husband had met the great Irish patriot Daniel O'Connell on several occasions, and had travelled in the same railway coach with him on one occasion. She stated that O'Connell was very gallant in her company, and occupied much of the time in conversing with her. She spoke of his sweet Irish accent. I suggested brogue, but she replied, no, it was not a brogue, it was a sweet Irish accent. One statement made by O'Connell during their conversation she said had made a lasting impression on her mind. Referring to capital punishment, O'Connell said he had always favored it until on one occasion 3 brothers were condemned and duly executed, although protesting their innocence. At the scaffold their mother fainted away in a dead fit. After the execution it was discovered that they were innocent. Frederick Douglass and all the great American abolitionists were well known to her and admired by her. She had 2 house servants and a maid. One of the servants had been in her employ 41 years and was treated as one of the family, and the other had been with her 29 years and was held in very high esteem. This grand old lady was bitterly opposed to vivisection of dumb animals and all other needless cruelties to them, and she still held in pleasant remembrance a faithful dog, which for 17 years was the constant companion of herself and husband. His grave was in her yard, and a headstone bore an inscription as to his friendliness and fidelity. She has long since gone to her rest, where all eyes are opened, and she now sees her lord and master face to face. This story would be singularly imperfect did it fail to make particular mention of Miss Eliza Wigham of No. 4S South Grey Street, Eden, where she had been in that identical house from her birth at the time when I first met her. She was then 75 and well preserved in health. Miss Wigham informed me that in 25 years she had not suffered a day's sickness. She was a member of the Society of Friends, Quakers, and in conversation she used their accustomed thee and thou. Her sympathies for the poor, the afflicted, and the oppressed were as wide and as deep as is suffering and need universal. The roll of membership list of every eleemosynary society and institution in Edinburgh bore her well-known name. She had, through her individual efforts, established a penny banking and depositing institution of which she was the sole corporate existence, and the poor of that city, both adults and children, were accustomed to entrust to her keeping, without any security whatever, their small earnings consisting of a few pennies each, and in some instances even a single penny. By so doing, in time each one had a small account with her, which was surrendered on demand. In a single year Miss Wigham had 10,000 transactions along this line, of which she kept a simple account without any assistance, often sitting up until 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. During the anti-slavery agitations in both England and the United States, she was a great power in behalf of the oppressed, and her acquaintance with all the anti-slavery workers was very extended. Her library, which was large and well selected, contained in it a number of books by colored authors, and much information concerning Africa and its inhabitants. One of the books written by a colored man which I scanned was that of John Box Brown. I asked her why the author bore such a unique name. She answered that he was so dubbed because he had escaped from slavery, nailed up in a box, so that they named him for the box. One of her dearest associates and friends was Mrs. Patterson, wife of Dr. Maurice Patterson, of 7 Hatton Place, Grange, Eden. One son of these distinguished people, Mr. R. H. Patterson, was at that time a student of law in the University of Edinburgh, and he was also the local secretary of the Society for the Recognition of the Universal Brotherhood of Man. When I spoke of the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, her eyes filled with tears, while the others cried, "Oh, for shame, for shame!" I must not protract these individual sketches, though the temptation to do so is great. One of the dwellings I loved to gaze upon at times was that of Sir William Simpson, the discovery of chloroform, which all the victims of the operating table will rise up and call blessed. In taking a rapid stroll through the streets and suburbs of Edinburgh, the objects of historic interest are so numerous and interesting as to fill one with astonishment. There in the High Street is the former residence of the late John Knox, the inflexible Presbyterian preacher of eternal damnation, whose denunciations of sin caused the unfortunate Queen Mary of Scotland to tremble. Next door is the Caruber's Close, of which I have spoken, the People's Temple, built in the first instance through the efforts of the late Dwight L. Moody, and afterwards enlarged, if I mistake not, through the generosity of the late Andrew Carnegie. Not far removed from here is the grand old church of St. Giles, in which John Knox, more than 300 years ago, preached. It has undergone changes on the interior, but it still maintained its original form and dignity on the outside. I heard an able and eloquent sermon preached in this church while in Edinburgh. In the neighbourhood, not far removed, stands Edinburgh Castle, now unfit for martial purposes, but of absorbing interest in the light of ancestral days. What most interested me was not the tower, the keep, or the antiquated big gun, but the cunning little dog cemetery, where lie the remains of a number of dogs, duly marked with slabs bearing inscriptions on them. Down at the other end of the old High Street is Holyrood Palace, once the home of royalty, but now only a curious relic of the past. In going to the palace, one passes through the Cannon Gate, so called, we are told, because King David I in the 12th century founded the Abbey of Holyrood, and gave the canons of the abbey the right to build a suburb between their church and the rock upon which stands the castle. And it is from this grant to the canons that the name of Cannon Gate is derived. Down under the high, steep rock on which stands the old castle is the grass market. Here, for a long time, criminals were executed, and I suspect some who were not criminals. Many, for conscience' sake, were tortured and killed by those who verily believed that they did God's service. It has been the way of the world. It is still the way of the world. The ruins on Calton Hill are a sight to behold. They remind one of the relics of some former Greek or Roman temple. It seems that an effort was made by a past generation of the good people of Edinburgh to build on the summit of this high hill a monument at once great and ornamental, but for some cause which I did not ascertain, the undertaking fell through, and there the good beginnings still lie in evidence. Author's Seat, another high rocky hill in the very shadow of which Holyrood Castle stands, is an object of curiosity, and many young tourists climb to the summit of it, whence they can view not all the kingdoms of the earth, but all of Edinburgh and much of the surrounding country. This writer mounted it, and was well repaid for the effort by the beautiful and grand scenery which confronted him. Returning to the home of Mrs. Saleeby, my hostess, we were abundantly refreshed and entertained by gentle social functions, and the hours sped rapidly and pleasantly. One of the objects attracting my attention and greatly interesting me was a fishwife, which I will here speak of briefly. The fishwife is not attractive to the eye of the average male, though I suppose in her settlement she has those who admire, woo, and marry her. She is short and stout in appearance, an effect which is not lessened by the fact that she wears from 8 to 10 heavy woolen skirts, as we are informed by the knowing ones. She carries fish in a basket or creel, which rests on her hips behind. The bundle of clothes which she wears breaks the weight on her back and protects her kidneys. The weight of her load at times amounts to 100 and 150 pounds. A strap attached to the sides of the creel passes over her forehead, and bending forward she thus sustains and carries the heavy load. These hard-working women live together in hamlets, and are very exclusive. They intermarry, which gives rise to physical defects and malformations to their disadvantage. We are told that the weight of the loads carried by them flattens the pelvis, and they are delivered with difficulty. The retina of the eye is to some extent disorganized, which is laid at the door of their marriages, often between blood relatives. The fishermen in these settlements seem to regard their duty as being fully performed when they have landed the fish, and they will stand and lean against a post, while the women lug the heavy loads to the top of the bluff. After that, the women are obliged to peddle the fish about the town. Before taking leave of Edinburgh, it was suggested that I visit the Great Forth Bridge, and also run up to the thrifty town of Kirkliston, the home of Reverend R. A. Landrum and his talented and agreeable wife, and in accordance with the suggestion I accomplished both facts. The Forth Bridge is one of the engineering wonders of the world, and is well worth the small time and trouble required to visit and behold it. It is related that during the time of its construction a town was built and inhabited in the vicinage, where thousands of workmen with their families in some instances resided until the great work was completed. In order that my readers may have some conception of the size and nature of this great structure, the following figures are given. It is a cantilever, arch, and truss bridge containing 2 spans. Each span is 1,710 feet in the clear, or 100 feet more than the clear span of the famous bridge between New York and Brooklyn. The total length of the bridge is 8,091 feet, and the center is supported by Inch Garvey, a little island. The abutments on Garvey consist of 4 steel pillars, 60 feet in diameter, and sunk down to the solid rock. The floor of the bridge is 150 feet above the water, and there is a depth of 200 feet of water under the center of the great spans. This wonderful bridge connects North Queen's Ferry with South Queen's Ferry, and is about 9 miles from Edinburgh. At Kirkliston I was the guest of Reverend and Mrs. Lendrum, and was entertained at the manse, which is the parish house of the Presbyterian Church, of which Mr. Lendrum was the pastor. Reverend Lendrum has served a church somewhere in the United States prior to my visit to Scotland, and was quite familiar with conditions relating to us colored people in our native land. However, this fact did not prevent either him or his good wife from treating me in every respect like a gentleman. Mrs. Lendrum, in the course of our conversations, often referred to John Knox Bacqui. She played and sang one or more of his musical compositions, and gave reminiscences of his conversation when on an occasion he too was a guest at the manse. Finally, I asked her of what nationality is Mr. Bacqui. She informed me that he was a Kaffir Negro, secretary to the mission at Lovedale, Cape Colony, South Africa. Imagine my surprise. From the laudations and frequent mention made of him, I concluded that he was some white man of intellectual and social standing. So much for having spent my whole life in a different social sphere of action. The meeting at Kirkliston was a great success. The audience was large, and the display of interest was reassuring. The pastor and his wife maintained 2 servants and kept a beautiful, cozy home. Reverend and Mrs. Lendrum, to my surprise, expressed a wish that I were black. He remarked that many of the Scotch and English young men and women were preparing for the mission fields of Africa, and that they were led into the service by the love of Christ, having no further interest in the Negro. As to the numbers of candidates, I had much information, for when I visited different departments of the great University of Edinburgh, I conversed with a goodly number of the students of both sexes, and to my agreeable surprise, I found that a large percentage of them were preparing for the African mission field. My duties being performed now in Edinburgh and vicinity, I reluctantly took my leave of the many dear friends within her walls, who had done so much for my pleasure and instruction, especially my very dear friend Mrs. Saleeby, and her 2 bright sons. Little did I surmise then that later on, 15 years later on, she would be domiciled at Chase Side Villa, Winchmore Hill, near London. Well, this writer and his dear wife, now deceased, would be temporarily in London, and that the social relations between us would be renewed and continued down to the present date, 27 years from our first acquaintance. End of chapter 12.